All right, so what we're looking at right now is a Dan Seagrave piece, and I'm looking at it on my extended monitor, which is over here, so I'm going to kind of be a little distracted facing this way. But what I want you to do is kind of like focus in on this with me here, because I was talking about how he breaks perspective. So we're just going to kind of zoom in on this piece. Now, Dan Seagrave, like I said, is a really established artist. He knows pretty much what the hell he's doing. And this is a piece he did for Trivium. So I've dropped it down and I'm on a new layer. And what I'm doing is I am going to just create a few guides. So what we're going to do is, as we scale out, we see that there's a few points of fixed perspective, but there's a lot of stuff in just weird, there we go, got to unlock them, in weird, like, just, contradictory perspectives, really. Okay, so there we go. We're just going to kind of create a few little vanishing points for the purpose of this demonstration. Let's zoom in again. So it looks like this is roughly going like that. I'm following the edge of the shadow. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm basically creating a small guide for his 3-point perspective. There we go. There's what I was looking for. So if I zoom this guy out and just follow along, it's turning purple, which says I'm basically following the line extension correctly. What I've done is I've created a small frame for this bottom part of the pier. And if I go about this process and just continue creating straight lines, hang on. So this is where it gets tricky, right? This ledge right here is really in perspective of, I think, this ledge. So I don't want to use that point. I want to go from here to here. I want to call that a line. I want to make that into a guide, and let's extend this out. So you're going to notice that this is essentially creating a series of vanishing points. Oh, there's the extension. So if I go back down here and drag this guy back out, they intersect just off of screen. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of just lining up his piece of art, and I'm looking at his primary focal point, which is basically this platform here. Hang on, zoom in a bit. My point placement isn't bad, but I'm on the wrong line. I want to be on this line. I want to grab this guy and kind of just go right behind the tip of his toe. So again, Dan Seagrave is a really respected artist. This was a piece he did for Trivium, but he was the guy who did Altars of Madness, which was Morbid Angel. Did that back in like 1988. So Dan's been around for a really long time, and it's because he's really good at what he does, and he's widely respected within the heavy metal community. So what you're seeing me do here is I'm basically very meticulously zooming in, zooming out. I'm moving around the piece, and I'm moving my lines. And then what I'm going to do is grab this guy, and I'm going to just wait until I see, oh, that's where they intersect. I'm going to grab this guy back down and drag it in, and boom. So now we kind of have a basic point. This right here is our right side, and it's just barely on screen, and the left side's way off screen. And the weird part is, like, let's look at this perspective, right? It's a straight line. It's going to go from right here through here. That is going to be our z-axis, right? So let's zoom out. Let's make that into a path, or not from a path into a guide. And let's extend it, and let's just drag it off page and just get it like super far out there. Okay, that's really weird to look at. Actually, let's bring this piece, this bottom piece back in, and let's just leave the top one off. Now, this left point and right point need to connect because that's going to serve as our back axis. Let's make those into a guide. Okay, so let's look at the structure of this. For starters, this wing, which is basically the highest point of the figure, is tangent to this line that is going across the two vanishing points. So again, you have this vanishing point, it's creating a V shape, and the web of my finger is what's coming at you. and these 2 points, these 2 fingers are disappearing off. Now, the interesting thing is he has 2 points that are on the page and the third one is off the page, but he hints at the third one because there's this tangent. So if you go from this point, like roughly around here, so if I hide these guides, if you look roughly around here and you follow your eye this way and you disappear out into here, and then you come across this way, and then you come back down, you can vaguely see a triangle. But you see that because I showed you the guides. If you had never seen the guides before, you wouldn't see that triangle because the crucial third point, which is over here off the canvas, you're not seeing it. It looks like a weird polygon because right here it's cutting off on this edge and then it's cutting off down here. So he's hiding his perspective. So the part that actually is, you know, creating the perspective that this figure is constrained by, and look, see the tip of the wing just barely grazes the outside portion of this piece of the perspective line. So like this figure is very much contained in this weird like spatial triangle, and like each plane that this figure exists on fits within this shape. Interestingly, we can add another line, and this will further demonstrate the z-axis. So if I zoom in, I'm going to say about there is where that pillar would end. Like that looks really close. And remember, we're not using the outer edge, we're using this inner one. His feet are pretty much contained on this square, but this one kind of goes off, right? It's like half on the square, half off of it. So we're going to use the slightly larger square and go to that one. Otherwise, if both of his feet were on this inner square, you could do the inner square, which would probably be easier. The smaller the shape you can use to outline your perspective, the better. So we now go to here, and what we really get is just the z-axis vanishing point for what's happening behind him. And of course, it's behind his knee, because if you saw this vanishing point right here, it would be a very obvious giveaway how he's setting up his perspective. And it wouldn't be bad, but like a good artist like Dan Seagrave knows to hide that. That's, I think, one of the traits of his art that's really interesting, is he tries to hide the focal points of his vanishing points. And the reason why the focus of his vanishing points he hides is because over here, if you look at this pillar, it's twisting. This right here, this is not in perspective. If it was in perspective, it would line up with this. This inner edge, which is warping, would line up here, and this outer plinth would stick out this way. Instead, it bows inwards. It has a concavity. It's instead of, how do I show you? Instead of being fixed like this, it's bending inwards and away from a straight line. And so because it's bending and away from it, we get this weird warping of perspective. And that's because he's constraining multiple types of perspective. See, really what's going on is there's another perspective line going on here. From this point through this line, kind of converging through that beak and into the tip of this right there. That's one other perspective line, right? And let's just go ahead and make that into a guide. Let's zoom out again, and let's just dump that into this shoot. Undo that. Let's dump this bad boy. Come on. There we go. Into this vanishing point. Now, notice when I did that, it's not ending at this exact spot right here. See that? That's on purpose. Anyone else doing that would be making a mistake. Here, Dan Seagrave is doing that shit on purpose. He is purposely misaligning the shape of this as he goes further down because he wants it to look like it's warping. That is really freaking weird. Like, let me bring that point back in, right? This is the normal vanishing point that this plane should roughly be on. this is the furthest most out point of the figure standing, and here's this point right here. Technically, you could argue that we should have this point really somewhere along here, in which case, if you want to make that argument, like, I can correct for that. If I bring that point here, bring this point, not that one, bring this point here, and bring this one in, you can still make the argument. Let me just delete this vertical one, or see if I can bring this vertical one back into form. Even if I'm using this outermost one, which I think is also kind of warped, I can't really tell because this shadow over here is kind of weird. Even if I bring this outermost one into perspective with this line, it's still warping a hell of a lot. And again, if I grab this guy and bring this guy back into its own constrained perspective, which I would say that's not where it lands. I just need to zoom in. I would say if I wanted to really get that, I want to go through here and I want to keep going forward like about so. I'd say that's pretty dead on. It's somewhere in the middle of this niche though. It's not really this edge, and it's not really this edge, and it's not really this interior. It's like somewhere in the middle. And that's because like his perspective is kind of melted. As he goes further down, it gets more and more off. So as I zoom out, here's our main perspective point on the right side, coming back in a little bit. I'm going to bring this guy back out. And yeah, we completely missed that point. Here is the main vanishing point, and here is the vanishing point for this little object right here. Which means as he goes further down, it warps more. Which is why these things are so freaking weird over here. Each one of these is on its own plane. Like, this is just nuts. Like, this is where looking at his work gets fun, because let's grab this guy and let's just go from the innermost edge to the outermost edge. No, let's not make it a shape. Let's just turn off all of the strokes because I don't want to see any of that nonsense. And let's just do some weird stuff like this. Okay, let's make those into guides. Okay, so I'm kind of cheating a little bit because, well, okay, let's not cheat. Let's just do this the hard way. Let's just build this one stone. I'm going to build one stone and show you what I mean by this. Boom. Each one of these is its own sort of like entity. Let's just grab these and make these both into guides. Okay, so for starters, like tombstones, everyone knows tombstones are flat. They don't warp, especially weirdly like this. If this was a straight up tombstone, these corners would go like this. I mean, within reason. Here they're ending like that, and then they're basically starting to warp to here, which is a different guide. Yes, there probably is a shortcut for making guides. I'm still kind of new to this stuff. But just because I'm new to digital art doesn't mean I don't know a small amount about perspective. I don't claim to be a master, but I do know a bit. And I really enjoy looking at perspective because I feel like it's one of the most interesting and challenging things to do within art. And it constantly makes you a better artist. Okay, let's just outline this edge, almost there. Maybe I'll figure out a way to fast forward this. Yeah, that is so trippy to look at. Okay. So for starters, what we're looking at here, now that we've built this top part, right? This part on the right-hand side is folding, and it's very dramatic here, but it's actually warping here. And the part that's really trippy about that is that this fold is really dramatic, which covers up the subtlety of this fold. So like in my honest opinion, like if this is probably the highest point, well, I guess the highest point would be right about here. If this is the highest point because it's the closest one to us, and we move these lines here, you'll see how there's a gap. Why is this bent backwards? It's like warped like a bowl, you know, it's like the stone is round. You know, headstones aren't like that. It's supposed to be flat, right? So like every little thing has warp to it, right? Even this plane, which appears flat, has some warp to it on this side. Every one of his planes starts off straight and then gradually warps at the edge, and he uses shadows to like confuse the viewer as to where the warping is appearing. A good example is this little arrow right here. This is trippy as hell, right? Like you've got this arrow that's in shadow, and like this part looks flat and is flat, but this part is clearly coming forward. So like, let me put it to you like this. This part is coming forward, and it's coming forward kind of like at a hip sort of position. So right below the arrow, this would be like the hip joint, and it's coming forward. So this arrow is kind of like flush, and you can tell that it's disappearing into here and into here. So there's like kind of some sort of center balance point, which is probably what this is running through. In fact, I could probably find it if I steal these guys right here and just, you know, reappropriate these. Yeah, it's even weirder because this extends outwards. This line is longer than this one. Jeez. So when you look at it, you can kind of like guesstimate, but when you actually pull out the rulers and start like measuring it in increments, that's when you really see how warped it is. I really like this piece, and I like deconstructing it just because it's a really obvious, you know, just mess of perspective. You know, all of these are obviously messed up. You can just look at them and they're all just disjointed and stuff. But when you zoom in and you look at little details like this, and you go over here, oh, and there's his name right there, Dan Seagrave, 2006. There you go, see? The man himself. When you look at this kind of stuff, basically what's going on is if I drop a 90-degree down from here, you're going to very clearly see that even his like more subtle lines are divergent. In fact, you can't even drop a true 90-degree because that's not even capable on this one. Let's make that a guide. So notice that, like, even though this one is basically longer than this one, they're diverging. They're not parallel, which is basically what would happen is like if this was truly made by a stone cutter, it would probably be parallel. And the crazy part is if you extend these, you will invariably find a vanishing point where they connect because it's inevitable. If the lines aren't perfectly parallel, there is inevitably a vanishing point. Let's just bring these together. Yep, there it is. There's another vanishing point. And that one's on screen. And guess what? That vanishing point kind of coincides with this one right here. Trippy, isn't it? He picks a vanishing point, and where that vanishing point ends, he puts another object to distract you from it. This is here so that you don't look at that point. And if this object, like let's say that little corner right here, this little nook right here of this cross aligned with that, it would kind of call attention to itself. And it's because this not only is an arrow shape, which in general like directs the eye, because that's what we use arrows for, but like just in general, just the vanishing points, the nature of them, draw your eye in this direction. So he moves it off. He kind of like does a bait and switch, and that's what makes his art so amazing. What I love about Dan Seagrave and the part of his work that influenced my work on my project was his just creative use of perspective. Everything is just really weirdly placed in his work. You've got this weird entity right here, and like this looks as if it's 2D. I'm probably looking at it the wrong way, but like I do think this would protrude more outward, and like this line right here, how it fades into the flat stone, kind of suggests that this was painted onto the stone instead of like a carved relief. So maybe that's something that is a niche detail that he maybe hasn't mastered as a traditional artist. But maybe while Dan Seagrave has like some deficiencies as a traditional artist, getting like true perfect like perspective to make this little like piece actually look 3D, if you zoom out and look at the overall image, and let's get rid of these guides for a second, this little figure in the gravestone is pretty small of an element. He's a pretty non-existent element. The main element is basically this angel figure, the moon, and like the orange and yellow tones. The yellow tones over here, the orange tones over here, contrasting the blue tones over here. There's no true black in any of this. I'm pretty sure everything is some arrangement of blue or purple for the dark tones. This is very like reddish purple. The figure is very much red. There's a lot of red in here. If I take the color picker out, that's definitely a purple. See, it's in the purple range. If I bring it over here, that is definitely in the purple range. That is not black. He has a good sense of like color tone. He has a really good sense of like warped perspective. Ironically, he has an amazing sense of warped perspective, and maybe his traditional perspective isn't as strong, but his perspective is really interesting nonetheless. And that's why he's one of the foremost artists in heavy metal. You know, he's been doing it since 1988, probably before even that. That's just when he did Morbid Angel's Altars of Madness, which was a pretty good album. That's Dan Seagrave, and that was his influence on me, you know, creating something that breaks perspective, right? So in my drawing, which I'm now going to bring up, oh, and that's Noah Bradley, who is he's an artist for Magic the Gathering. That background there, I love that. It's very relaxing to look at, especially when Illustrator freezes and crashes on me and gives me a fucking meltdown. So what we're looking at right now is basically the final render, test render. This is 20 by 20, and oh man, did I go through a lot of renditions of this to really get to this version. For starters, if you notice, version 6, the clouds are a teeny bit off center. Here's 7, here's 6, 7, 6. They're just, you can see it tweak. It was something that I noticed. I was like, wait a second, that's just a little bit off. Anyway, this version I'm really proud of, because what you saw me do in the Dan Seagrave piece is what I did here. I perspective checked everything, which was really hard to do. And I'll show you that project file in a second, the one that produced this. But what I'm most proud of is just the simplification of it. When I made the tower here, I really wanted to make something dynamic and very like flat looking. Like dynamic as in the line art was very much like lightning and very like energetic, but was flat. Because I'm not really that good at perspective. I'm still learning it and I'm getting better at it. I wanted to maybe steal one of Dan Seagrave's concepts of breaking perspective. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna have everything in the front and every main layer in perspective, but I'm gonna have the tower break perspective because I want it to look weird. The problem is it's not a bad shape, it's just a very busy shape. And the clouds don't really work because they're getting cut off. And the point of the clouds are to accentuate the tower and not compete with the tower. Instead of it being sort of like drawing your eyes upwards, it's kind of like pointing downwards because the clouds are descending. They're getting tighter as it moves inwards. And I wanted it to look like it was opening up, but it was opening up too wide because this middle shape here was just way too broad and far out from the center point here. So when I went through and got the clouds lined up in version 7, I decided to make them ascend. So they got smaller as they went up, and it kind of actually created a cone shape like an hourglass. And the center point of the hourglass is where there's the most amount of tension, which is kind of like right here, but these clouds end above the center point, and they kind of like point into the vortex, but the vortex kind of points back downwards. And just overall, like, the tower shape is simplified. It's just like a flat entity. It's not very descriptive, and it doesn't really need to be, because this is just a perspective check. And when I do the final drawing, I'm going to add a whole lot more to it, you know, doing it by hand, rendering it, than I can confidently and in a time-effective manner doing this version of Illustrator. You know, I really can't produce a whole lot of Illustrator artwork at a really top tier. And I'm starting to realize, like, Illustrator isn't really the program for me, that I need to spend more time working in Photoshop. And it's not that Illustrator is bad, it's just that the amount of time I put into building this, I don't think I'd ever do that again in Illustrator. I learned a lot. I appreciate, like, the lessons I learned in perspective from building this, but this was painful. I mean, let's zoom in with this guy. There we go. If I zoom in, you got like these little shapes over here and stuff, and they're like going into this waterfall that's going all the way down, and it doesn't look very high res right now because it's kind of like loading a JPEG as I move it around. But like all of these little shapes, like there's this thin little slice going along here, there's slices along the ridges. These are all things, you know, describing the change in plane. And I kind of set out to like kick my own ass with this project, and I really wanted to be like super niche perfectionist with my perspective, because I knew I wasn't that great at it. So I wanted to make something that like really challenged me and improved my sense of perspective. And you know, this was the project that did that. It really it improved my skills. I'm really proud of it. I'm going to show you a few reference things real quick that also helped me out along the way. We're going to actually open up the file now in Illustrator. We're going to close this one out. And yeah, we're going to go to version 6, and we're going to open up version 8. Okay, let's get rid of the artboard mask. Okay, let's zoom out. The perspective extends beyond the mask like I showed you in the previous version. There's not too many guides left because I built these around the mat. So I guess this isn't the right one to show you. Hang on a second. Let me find the right one to show you. Maybe it is 5? Yes, it looks like it's 5. Let's fix this and take off the mat. Cool, let's zoom back out. So for starters, you know, I built all the clouds on the right-hand side. And you can see this outline right here is different from these. I ended up tweaking the spacing a little bit. So even when I built it, I still was playing with it after it was built with the guides. But yeah, really what I want to focus on are these guides right here going along this top half of the plane. And they all disappear into here. And also you'll see these guides coming out of here in a second. I'll tell you about those in a moment. These ones that are coming out of here, what they're doing is they're describing all the little features coming out of here. So like this is probably what you could argue is the furthest most point on the entire thing. That red line that you're seeing highlight is the furthest most point on the left-hand side of this. And then over here, it looks like it's dead. Yep, it's dead center. Sometimes from a distance they look like they're off. That one's dead on, and that one should be, yep, dead on, yeah. They all intersect. Those all intersect the furthest most point going out. So if I wanted to do something helpful to all of you, I'm going to just grab one from the side and kind of drag it in. Almost there, almost there. All right, now that's good. Okay. This line though that you see that's moving up and down, that's the one that is touching the furthest most point of this shelf. That's the furthest most forward point of this shelf. This right here is back. This point right here is kind of like back from the rest of it. But it's pretty much at the center of the entire piece. I mean, it's not dead center. I'd say maybe this corner is the centermost part. But this line that we're seeing is kind of like the central viewing point. It's like, it's a little bit off axis. It's like here's center and here's the viewer just a little bit off. And the viewer is kind of looking at it from a skewed angle. And these points I was talking about down here, they form the bottom of these ridges. And I was trying to make the ridges going down the front half of it sort of like fit into the planar description that I was creating and making everything fit correctly on planes. I'm going to just hide these guides for a second. When you look at this version, you can kind of see how everything locks into place. And then if I turn on the guides, you kind of see it, and then I take them away, and you can see more of them. And those guides are only really talking about the top half of this plane, which is like this top plane right here, this top part of the shelf that's moving downwards is being described by these guides. That's all it's doing. It's just describing these back, from all the way back here, from this kind of like back area across this flat top. It's not even describing the mountain shapes. Each one of these tiny little shapes that were in the mountains, like this little sliver, this wall right here, this kind of weird shape that's like in between a bunch of stuff, those were all perspective checked in 3-point, which means front line, cross line, set up the crosshairs where it's really a trifecta, and then that creates the forwardmost point, and then you perspective check the other points from there. So you remember how we were moving through the Dan Seagrave piece and I was dropping down the 3 lines, and then we could see that one was crooked and like curving around the perspective line. That's Dan Seagrave breaking perspective. None of this breaks perspective, but this thing right here is like a flat 2-dimensional object, and it totally breaks perspective. It's just plastered in there, and that's done on purpose because I want it to look weird. I don't want it to look natural. I want you to see it and be like, what the hell? Kind of like that angel. The angel is a fixed figure, and then the angel is the static point in the picture, and then everything else is chaos around it. Ironically, in Dan Seagrave's picture, this guy right here, the angel, which is a living, breathing, physically moving object, is the static point, and like all this, the ground, the earth, the cityscape in the background is all moving, right? We don't normally see buildings move. That doesn't make sense to us. But in this one, the buildings, the pillar that he's standing on is twisting into itself. The top is flat and the bottom is like conical and like twisting inward. All of these are jutting outwards like jagged teeth, you know? Yeah, these look like teeth to me. They look like really weird stubby teeth. You know, that's all of the tension, and the figure is angelic and is the point of stationary balance. It's kind of ironic that it's a dark looking angel, and yet like symbolically angels are, you know, associated with serenity and like holiness and so forth. And like he's made like a dark angel, and yet ironically this dark angel is still like a point of balance and focus and serenity in a very like chaotic piece. I think that's really interesting. He's portraying a morbid angel. Gotcha. He's portraying a morbid angel as a serene image in a really crazy, fucked up background. I don't know, man. That's what you can get from just perspective. And in my case, the background is the serenity, and this tower is kind of like this chaotic focal point. but even then the tower is meant to be very beckoning and warm and bright. In this one, obviously, I chose better colors than the original rendition, which had really bad color choice. There's very little technical changes. The things that did change were the tower and the clouds and the background colors and the vortex colors. And that seems like a lot, but really like 95% of the work was building all these freaking rocks and building this cave thing over here and this weird little bridge thing in the middle and stuff. I really tried to, on this version of the project, make my layers way more consistent, and it ended up in the long run helping me out. I can turn the sky off with one button. I can turn the background third off with another button. I can turn the clouds off with another one. That's actually kind of cool if you want to just look at the vortex itself and just get a reference for it by itself. The middle section, it takes away the tower and that whole middle shelf, and then that comes back into play. And then the front third basically takes away the bridge, the island, and everything else. So technically without the front third, you could argue it's a completed piece. It's kind of like a floating landmass that looks really distant. But I feel like by putting the bridge into it, it's saying like, hey, you can get there. There's this mysterious cave. If you find a way to enter the cave, this is the exit, and it takes you to this cool bridge, to this other cool bridge, which takes you to the tower. And if you get rid of it, you still have a really cool like Roger Dean piece, but this is what kind of like makes it adventure time, you know? And that was another thing I wanted to do. I wanted to introduce storytelling into it. I wanted to feel like when you looked at the piece, it wasn't just like some faraway place, but it was like a goal. Like you wanted to go to this place, like on a pilgrimage. And that's because when Jeff told me about his vision that he had, it was about this flash tower with eyes. And again, I have to do more detail. The eyes will be drawn at the end. But it was this beckoning flesh tower that was kind of like growing and melting out of the mountains upwards into the sky, into this vortex. And I remember the main question I asked him is it like a beckoning tower or a foreboding one? And because he said it was beckoning, you know, that's what defined my color choice in the end. Yeah, that was like 150 hours, man. But I'm proud of it because I feel like I accomplished something. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this in depth in my entire life. And I think it shows. So, yeah, that's, I guess, the second half of the art update. The next part will be moving away from digital to, like, drawing it. I don't really have anyone teaching me. I'm figuring it out by watching YouTube. So if somebody like me can figure it out, then you totally can too. So go out and make stuff. As Bob Ross would say, happy painting and God bless. I can't say that with a straight fucking face. Peapocket the squirrel. Or no, it's Peapod the squirrel, the pocket squirrel. Yeah. Peapod the pocket squirrel is also my friend.